Chapter 3. The river Slod meanders slowly across the plains. It is said to trace the path left behind by a giant snake that slithered from the mountains to the west, through the plains to the eastern sea, and its wide, slow path is an essential transportation route for the region. Pasio is a large port town situated near the midpoint of the river. Not far upstream lie large fields of wheat. Still farther are thickly forested mountains. Logs are floated downstream year-round. Barges carrying wheat or corn, depending on the season, navigate up and down the river. That alone would be enough to ensure the town's prosperity, but because there are no bridges across the Slod, its ferries make it a natural gathering place. It was past afternoon, but not yet dusk. Lawrence and Holo arrived during the busiest time of the day. Pasio's trade had grown since the town recovered its autonomy from the monarchy. Now merchants and aristocrats ruled it. Consequently, there were heavy tariffs levied on goods entering the town, but there were no immigration checks or demands for identification. Had it been a castle town, the opposite would be true, and Holo's non-human status would be a problem. "Have they no king here?" was Holo's first utterance upon arriving in the city. "Is this your first time coming to a city of this size?" "Times surely change. In my day, a city this large would have been ruled by a king." Lawrence felt a slight sense of superiority. He'd been to cities many times the size of Pasio. He tried not to let it show, lest Holo pointed out, and in any case, he'd been just as naive when he first started out. "I'll just say that your intentions are admirable," quipped Holo. Apparently, Lawrence had been a bit careless about hiding his thoughts. Although Holo's attention was focused on the many shops that lined the road, she'd still noticed his expression. Had it just been a lucky guess? The idea that she could discern his thoughts so easily was unsettling, and far from funny. "This isn't a festival, is it? If it were a church celebration day, the streets would be so crowded we couldn't pass through them. Today, though, there's still space." "Oh, difficult to imagine that," said Holo with a smile, leaning out of the cart and scanning the merchant stalls they passed. She looked every bit the country bumpkin on her first visit to the town, but Lawrence suddenly thought of something else. "Hey, was her only response as she continued to stare at the many vendors. "Will it be all right, not covering your head?" "Huh? Head?" "I know it's festival time in Paslo right now, so most of the villagers will be drinking and celebrating. But not all of them, and some of the ones who don't may be visiting Pasio right now." "Oh, that," said Holo, sitting back down in the wagon, suddenly irritated. She looked back at Lawrence, her cloak just barely covering her ears. "Even if they could see my ears, nobody would notice. They've all long forgotten about me." There was such vehemence in her voice it was a miracle she didn't shout. Lawrence reflexively raised his hands as if calming a startled horse. Holo was no horse, but it seemed to have some effect. She snorted derisively and pulled the cloak down, facing ahead and pouting. "You lived there for hundreds of years. Surely there are some legends passed down about you. Or did you never take human form?" "There are legends, and sometimes I'd appear as a human." "So there are stories about you appearing as a human?" Holo gave Lawrence a belabored, sidelong glance, sighed, then spoke. "As far as I remember, it went something like this. She looks like a beautiful girl of about 15. She has long, flowing brown hair and wolf ears, along with a white-tipped tail. Sometimes she would appear in this form, and in exchange for keeping her appearance a secret, she promises a good harvest." Holo regarded Lawrence flatly with a look that said, "Happy?" "Well, it sounds like you pretty much told them everything about yourself. Is that really okay?" "Even if they were to see my ears or tail, they would doubt. Just as you did. They'll never realize the truth." Holo slipped her hand underneath the cloak and fussed with her ears, perhaps because they pushed against the inside of the fabric uncomfortably. Lawrence looked sideways at her. He wanted her to be more careful, but if he said as much, she would surely get genuinely angry. It seemed that discussion of Paslo was taboo. He felt better when he considered that the legends of Holo made no mention of her actual facial features, only identifying her by her ears and tail. As long as she kept those concealed, she would go unnoticed. Legends were just legends. It was not as if she were on a church wanted poster. A few moments after, Lawrence resolved not to press the matter. Holo appeared to be considering something. At length she spoke. "Hey." Even should they see me, they won't know who I am. will they?" Her mood had changed completely from before. It was almost as if she wanted to be discovered. But Lawrence was no fool. He stared expressionlessly forward at the horse. "It is certainly my hope that they won't," he answered. Holo smiled slightly, almost ruefully. "You needn't worry." Once Holo started looking happily at the stalls again, Lawrence realized she'd been speaking to herself as well as him. There was no need to press the matter, however. Holo was quite stubborn. Lawrence couldn't help smiling at Holo now. She'd cheered out completely and was excitedly looking at the delicious fruits they passed. "There's quite a collection of fruit. Are they all picked nearby?" "It's because Pazio is the gateway to the south. When the season's right, you can even see fruit from regions nearly impossible to visit." "There is much fruit in the south, and good." "Surely you have fruit in the north as well." "Aye, but it's a bit tough and bitter. To make it sweet it must be dried and cured. We wolves can't do much such work, so we have to take it from the villagers." Lawrence would have expected birds, horses, or sheep to be more likely targets for wolves. It was hard to imagine them driven by a desire for something sweet. Perhaps a bear. Bears often took the leather bags filled with grapes that hung from the eaves of houses. I would think wolves would prefer spicy things. It's bears that crave sweets. "We don't like spicy food. Once we found red fang-shaped fruit among the cargo of a shipwreck. We ate it and regretted it loud and long." "Ah, hot peppers. Expensive, those. We dunked our heads in the river and decided humans were terrifying indeed," said Holo with a chuckle, enjoying the memory for a moment as she gazed at the stalls. After a time her smile faded, then finally reappeared as she sighed. The pleasure of nostalgia is never without its companion, loneliness. Lawrence was trying to decide what he should say when Holo seemed to perk up. "If it's red fruit we're talking about, I'd rather have those," she said, tugging on his clothing and pointing out a stall. Beyond the stream of passing people and wagons there was a stall with a generous pile of apples. "Oh, those are fine apples." "Are they not?" Holo's eyes glittered beneath the cloak. He wondered if she noticed that her tail was swishing back and forth underneath her skirts. Perhaps she really did like apples. "They look rather toothsome, no?" "Indeed." What Holo was hinting at was clear enough, but Lawrence pretended not to notice. "Now that I think of it, I had a friend who invested more than half his worth in apples. I'm not sure where they were from, but if they turned out like these, he surely doubled his money." Lawrence sighed regretfully. "I should have done the same." Holo's expression shifted as if to say, "That's not the point I was trying to make." But again, Lawrence pretended not to notice. "Humph. Well, that's most unfortunate," Holo replied. "But the risk was very high. If it were me, I would have transported them by ship." "A ship, you say?" As they talked, they continued to move along the road, the clapping of the horses' hooves as accompaniment. Holo was becoming anxious. She clearly wanted the apples, but was just as clearly loath to say so, hence her agitated responses to Lawrence's comments. "You see, a group of merchants will sometimes pool their money to hire a ship. The amount of money they raise determines the amount and type of cargo, but unlike land transport, if there is an accident you may lose lives as well as money. Even a strong wind can put you in danger. However, there is profit to be had. I have twice traveled by sea this way, so—" "What's wrong?" They passed the apple booth, and it began to recede behind them. There was nothing more fun than knowing the heart of another. Lawrence smiled his best merchant smile. "Right, so about shipping. Apples. I want apples." Lawrence thought she'd be stubborn until the end, but since she finally admitted her desire, he decided to go ahead and treat her. "Earn your own food, why don't you?" Holo glared at Lawrence as she munched away on an apple. He made a show of shrugging helplessly. She'd been so charming when she finally gave in and admitted her desire that Lawrence had generously given her a silver trenny coin of considerable value. She'd returned with more apples than she could carry. She appeared not to know the meaning of the word restraint. By the time her face and hands were sticky with juice well into her fourth apple, she got around to complaining again. "You, Munch, earlier you pretended like you didn't notice." "It's amusing knowing what someone else is thinking," said Lawrence to Holo as she ate the apple down to its core. Thinking he'd have one for himself, Lawrence reached back to the pile of apples in the wagon bed, but Holo slapped his hand away even as she started on her 5th apple. Mine. Hey, I paid for them. Holo's cheeks were stuffed. She waited until she had finished swallowing to reply. I'm Holo the Wise Wolf. I can make this much money any time I want. Don't let me stop you. I'd planned to use that money for lodging tonight. But Answer once you're done eating, please. Holo nodded and didn't speak again until her stomach contained no less than 8 apples. Did she still intend to have dinner after all that? Phew, you certainly ate a lot. Apples are the devil's fruit, full of tempting sweetness as they are. Lawrence couldn't help laughing at her overstatement. Shouldn't a wise wolf be able to conquer temptation? While one may lose much because of avarice, nothing was ever accomplished by abstinence. The sight of Holo licking her fingers clean of the sweet juice strengthened her argument. If it meant missing such pleasure as this, asceticism was the height of folly. All this was merely academic, of course. So, what was that you were going to say earlier? Oh yes, I've no money and no immediate means to earn money. So as you do business, I'll just put a few words in to help you bring in more profit. Agreed? No merchant worth his salt simply answers agreed when so asked. It's common sense to refrain from answering until making sure of the other party's intentions. A verbal contract is still a contract, and must be honored, come what may. Thus Lawrence didn't answer right away. He didn't understand what Holo was getting at. You'll soon be selling the marten furs, yes? As if guessing at the reason for his hesitation, Holo turned to the wagon bed behind them. Today, hopefully, no later than tomorrow. Well, I'll try to say something to bring your profit up, if I can. Whatever the difference I make, I keep, she said, licking her little finger clean as if it were nothing. Lawrence mulled it over. Holo seemed confident that she could sell the marten pelts higher than he could. Wise wolf or no, he had 7 years of experience as a traveling merchant. He wasn't such a weak dealer that a few words tossed in from the side would bring up his prices, and there was no guarantee the buyer would accept such prices. Yet his curiosity at exactly how she would attempt this farce overpowered his doubt that it would actually happen, so in the end he said, Agreed. It's done then, replied Holo, burping. But this isn't just limited to our pelts. You're a merchant too. There may be no chance for me to talk up our price. How modest of you. Wisdom is knowing thyself first. The statement would have sounded better had she not said it while casting her gaze longingly back toward the remaining pile of apples. The pelts' destination was the Malone Company, a brokerage house that acted as an intermediary for a variety of goods. The Malone Company was the 3rd largest house in the city. The 2 above it were local businesses that had their headquarters in Pasio. The Malone Company was headquartered in a mercantile nation far to the south, and run by a powerful trader of noble lineage. The Pasio location was a branch. Lawrence had chosen the Malone Company over the local brokerages because it would pay higher commodity prices in order to best its competitors, and also because, having so many branches in different places, it could provide valuable information. His aim was to dig up information akin to the story he heard from the young merchant Zarin. Who better to ask about currency exchange than traders who routinely crossed borders to do business? After securing lodgings for the 2 of them, Lawrence trimmed his beard and set out. The Malone Company was the 5th building from the docks and the 2nd largest shop in the area. It had a huge gate that faced the docks to accommodate wagon traffic, which made the shop seem even bigger at a glance. Commodities of all kinds were piled around the gates, as if to show off the company's prosperity. It might have been their peculiar way of competing with the local businesses, which could trade on their long-standing local connections and didn't need flashy displays to prove they were turning a profit. Lawrence stopped his wagon at the loading area, and presently an employee came out to meet them. Welcome to the Malone Trading Company. The smart-looking man tasked with unloading had a neatly trimmed beard and hair. Normally, a trading company's unloading dock was a chaotic swirl of bandit-like men, shouting this way and that. Malone was an exception. I've sold wheat here before, but today I have furs to sell. Will you take a look? Yes, but of course. The man inside and to the left will be happy to see you. Lawrence nodded and with a flick of the reins drove the wagon inside. Around the area were stacked all sorts of goods. Wheat, straw, stones, timber, fruit, and more. The staff was quick and efficient, which is how the Malone Company was successful even in foreign countries, a fact that would impress any traveling merchant. Even Holo seemed impressed. "Ho there, sir. Where are you headed?" The two were watching the busy loading and unloading in the shop, but stopped at the sound of the voice. They looked in its direction and saw a large man with steam rising from his sun-tanned body. He didn't seem like the man Lawrence had been directed to find, but he was certainly huge. "Is he a knight?" Holo said under her breath. "We're here to sell furs. I was told to come to the left side of the shop." Lawrence met the man's eyes and smiled. "Right then, I'll just take your horse. This way, if you please." Lawrence did as he was told and angled his horse toward the man. The horse snorted. Apparently he sensed the man's vitality. "Ho, a good horse, sir. He looks stout of heart." "He works without complaint, I'll say that much," said Lawrence. "A horse that complains. Now that would be something to see." "You're not kidding." The two men laughed, and the worker led Lawrence's horse inside the unloading area, and after hitching him to a sturdy wooden fence, called out. The person that answered was a man who looked more fit to be carrying a quill and ink than hay bales. He seemed to be the buyer. "Craft Lawrence, I presume? We thank you for your patronage." Lawrence was used to being greeted politely, but he was impressed that the man knew his name before Lawrence had given it. He had last visited the company during a winter 3 years ago, selling wheat. Perhaps the man that now greeted Lawrence in the entryway still remembered him. "I'm told you've come to sell furs today." The buyer skipped over the usual pleasantries about the weather and jumped straight to the heart of the matter. Lawrence coughed slightly and shifted into his trader persona. "Indeed I have. These are the very ones, here in the back of the wagon, 70 total." He hopped down from the wagon and invited the buyer to view the furs. He was followed by Holo, who jumped down from the wagon a moment later. "Oh, these are good marten furs indeed. The year has been a good one for crops, so marten fur is scarce." About half the marten fur that reached the marketplace came from farmers who hunted in their free time. When the harvest was plentiful, they were too busy to hunt, and marten fur was scarcer. Lawrence decided to push his position. "You only see furs this fine once every several years. They were drenched with rain on the way here, but look, they have lost none of their luster." "'Tis a fine luster, to be sure, and with good lie. What of their size?" Lawrence pulled the largest pelt from the bed and offered it to the buyer, since it was generally prohibited for people other than the owner of the goods to touch them. "Ho, they're not lacking in size. You said you had 70? He didn't ask to see all the pelts. He was not so unrefined. Here was the challenge of trade. There was no buyer that would not want to see each pelt, but likewise was there no seller that would want to show each. This was the intersection of vanity, propriety, and desire. "Well then, Sir Lawrence, my apologies, Sir Lawrence. You've come to trade with us because you sold wheat here in the past?" The same name was pronounced differently in different nations. It was a mistake Lawrence himself made often enough. So he forgave it with a smile and produced a wooden abacus from his pocket, which the man looked at. Different regions and nations had different ways of writing numbers, and because nothing was harder than trying to puzzle through these differences, merchants hardly ever wrote figures down while negotiating. Moving the wooden bead to the abacus would make the numbers completely clear, although one still had to be mindful of exactly what currency was being counted. "I can offer, say, 132 silver trenny." Lawrence pretended to think on the matter for a moment. "You don't see furs like these often. I brought them to you because I've done business with you in the past, but—" "We certainly appreciate your business. For my part, I'd like to continue our association. As would we, I assure you. In light of friendly relations, then, what say you to 140? It was a somewhat transparent exchange, but within the mutual deception was truth, which made the dealings more interesting. 140 trenny was a good price. It wouldn't be wise to push past that. But just when Lawrence was about to say, "It's done, then," Holo, who'd been silent up until that point, tugged slightly on his sleeve. "Excuse me a moment," said Lawrence to the buyer, then leaned down, putting his ear level with Holo's hood. "I don't quite know. Is that a good price?" "Quite good, yes," said Lawrence simply, smiling to the company representative. "Well then, do we have an agreement?" It seemed the buyer was ready to conclude the deal. Lawrence smiled and was about to reply. "Wait just a moment." "What?" said Lawrence without thinking. Before he could say anything further, she kept speaking, just like a canny merchant would. 140 trenny, you said, yes? Yes. 140 in silver tranny pieces, answered the representative, a bit taken aback by the sudden question from the up-to-now silent Holo. Women were rare in places of trade, not unheard of, but rare. For her part, Holo either didn't know or didn't care. She spoke as freely as she pleased. Ah, perhaps you didn't notice? The buyer, quite taken aback, looked at Holo. He seemed not to understand what she was getting at. Lawrence didn't know either. My apologies, but have I overlooked something? The buyer, a merchant from a neighboring country, looked to be roughly the same age as Lawrence. He was a veteran of countless negotiations, who dealt with innumerable parties in his career. It was to his credit that despite his experience, he appeared to be sincerely apologizing to Holo. Of course, it was far from surprising that he was taken aback. Holo had effectively asked him if he knew what he was looking at. I can see you're a fine merchant, so surely you pretended not to notice? I can see I won't need to hold back with you. Holo grinned underneath her cloak. Lawrence nervously hoped she wasn't showing her fangs, but more than anything, he wanted to know what she was doing. The buyer had been accurate and honest. If Holo was telling the truth, then Lawrence himself had also missed an important detail, which was impossible. My intention is anything but, I assure you. If you'll kindly point out what you're speaking of, we will be happy to adjust the price appropriately. Lawrence had never seen a buyer act so meekly. To be sure, he'd seen them pretend meekness, but this was no act. Holo's words had a strange weight, and her delivery was perfect. Master, she said to Lawrence, it's not polite to make sport of people. It was hard to tell whether she called him master to mock him, or because it was appropriate to the situation. But in either case, if he bungled his response here, he knew he'd hear about it later. He frantically groped for a response. That was certainly not my aim, but perhaps you should be the one to tell him. Holo grinned a lopsided grin at Lawrence, flashing a fang. Master, pass me a fur, if you please. Here. It struck Lawrence as silly that he had to exert himself to maintain his dignity in the face of being called master. Holo was the only master here. Thank you, master. Now, if you please, sir, said Holo, turning to the buyer and showing him the fur. At a glance, its lay, size, and luster did not seem to merit an increased price. Even if she were to talk up the lay as being especially fine, the buyer would unavoidably ask to examine the fur more closely, and would inevitably find flaws. The price was unlikely to drop, but the relationship between buyer and seller would suffer. These are fine furs, as you can see, Holo said. I quite agree, replied the buyer. You won't see their like in many years. Or perhaps I should put it this way. You won't smell their like in many years. Holo's words froze the air in an instant. Lawrence had no idea what she was talking about. 'Tis a scent, but to miss it you'd need to be blind. Holo laughed. She was the only one. Lawrence and the buyer were too stunned to be amused. Well, the smell is worth 1,000 words. Would you care to sample the scent? Holo handed the pelt to the buyer, who took it and looked uncertainly toward Lawrence. Lawrence nodded slowly, hiding his confusion. What was the point in smelling the pelts? He had never heard of such a thing in all his dealings. Neither had the buyer, surely, but he had no choice but to placate his vendors. He slowly brought the fur up to his nose and sniffed. At first, his face showed a mixture of confusion and surprise. He sniffed again, and only the surprise remained. Oh, smell something, do you? Holo said. Yes. It smells like fruit, I'd say. Lawrence looked at the fur in surprise. Fruit? Fruit indeed. Just as fur is scarce this year because of the harvest, so did the forest overflow with fruit. This marten was scampering about in that same forest until just a few days ago, and it ate so much of that plentiful fruit that the scent suffused its body. The buyer sniffed the fur again. He nodded as if to say, True enough. The truth is that while the fur's luster might be better or worse, it generally changes little. Does the problem not come, then, when the fur is made into clothing, when it is actually used? Good fur is durable, bad fur soon wears thin. True, as you say, said the buyer. Lawrence was astonished. How much did this wolf know? As you can tell, this particular fur is the sweet scent of a marten that is eaten very well indeed. It took 2 strong men to pull the hide clear of the body. It was so tough. The buyer tugged on the fur experimentally. He couldn't pull too hard on goods he hadn't yet purchased, though, something Holo knew full well. She was a perfect merchant. The fur is as strong as the beast itself was, and will keep the wearer as warm as a spring day, shedding rain from dawn till dusk. And don't forget the scent. Imagine coming across a perfumed piece of clothing like this among coats made from nose-wrinkling marten fur. Why, 'twould sell so dear your eyes would pop out." The buyer was indeed imagining the scenario, gazing off into the distance. When Lawrence thought about it, he could see that the goods would sell high. Or perhaps he could smell as much. "So, what do you think would be a fair price, then?" The buyer snapped out of his reverie and straightened himself, then played with some figures on his abacus. The beads flew back and forth with a pleasant tack-tack-tack sound, finally displaying a figure. "What say you to 200 trenny?" Lawrence's breath caught in his throat. 140 pieces were already a respectably high price. 200 was unimaginable. Holo murmured to herself. He wanted to beg her to stop. This was going too far, but she was implacable. "How about 3 pieces for each fur, 210 in total?" Well... "Master," she said to Lawrence, "perhaps we should try elsewhere." No, 210 pieces then," said the buyer. Hearing this, Holo nodded, satisfied, and turned to her master. "You heard the man, master." She was definitely teasing him.